Hi, Tim Burridge, MHRA. A question for Dr. Kelly Berube. Is that correct? Sorry if I pronounced it wrong. So what actually are you measuring on these in this sort of lung, artificial lung that you've developed? Once you've got it, what do you actually do with it?
It depends on the project that's funded in the lab at the time. We do lots of candidate drug screening. We also test indoor, outdoor air, etc. Some of the work I'm not, what do you call it? What do you sign your life away? We're not allowed to talk about it, unfortunately. But it is candidate lung drugs, lung medicine that we're testing. That's as far as I can say.
Kevin Adams, associated with Ethical Tissue. You said, Bob, it's a long, drawn-out process, and I think I've heard you talk about this for the last 15 years or more. We've got the ICH process that's been set up to look at regulatory toxicology safety assessment, and there's no, as far as I understand, no real effort to get an expert working group into that process to look at the use of human tissue and how it could benefit that kind of process. And is that perhaps something the regulatory authorities, pharma industry, etc., should be looking at and trying to push forward?
This one? That's fine. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I made the point about needs to have rather than sort of nice to have with human tissue work. And it can only be a need to have if it is a regulatory requirement. And I think this is something that needs to be taken very seriously. The regulators need to look at the potential of this approach to drug evaluation, drug testing, and if appropriate, and I mean it still needs to be proven. I think that that human tissue work is going to be more effective than the animal-based tests we currently use. I think logically it should be, but we really do need to undertake that. And I think that now is the time for the regulatory authorities certainly to be thinking about it, to be looking at those tests which are already in place and are already tried, tested, and are proving effective, and to really think how they can help us drive the whole process forward. I mean, there are lots of stakeholders here, lots of people that need to be involved. The regulators are one, but the other players are all represented here, and I think that somehow we need to get together and make this a regulatory requirement.
Thanks, one point.
Is this on?
No.
No.
Sorry, I was not here.
I'll make one point, and then I have one question for most of the speakers, and it touches on what Bob said. Somebody very wise, and it wasn't me, said all models are flawed but some are useful, and I think that applies both to animal models and to human tissue models as well, and the onus is on us as scientists to derive the best models wherever that tissue comes from. Now, having said that, I am a supporter of the use of human tissue. My question to all the speakers is, nobody has mentioned stem cells, and I forgot to say my affiliation at the start of this, as I'm representing not just AstraZeneca but stem cells for Safer Medicines, and I'd like to know what all the three speakers think, or four speakers think, about stem cells as a source of material where one of your stated problems is the ease of access to material.
I guess the time limitation's a very good point, that certainly stem cells would be one way that we could get around the issues of availability and throughput, because the test that I really spoke about, we use relatively late in the process, although I said fail fast, fail early. What surprised us is that people are using them fairly close to the clinic. The beauty of the stem cell work is that you can incorporate an earlier screen, so I would see it as complementary to the whole tissue, intact tissue, where you have the intact three-dimensional structure of the tissue retained, and you have the variability from person to person, which is valuable. With the stem cell techniques, you have the potential for perhaps from one individual to have a really high throughput of tests, so more reproducible, and would perhaps allow better selection of candidates. but then I would still argue that you would also have the need for a preclinical test. So I could see that, you know, that there's a chain of events that human tissue could be applied in.
Would any of our other speakers
Well, just very briefly, just to say that I think that stem cells are probably the future. I think the degree of inter-individual variability is a problem with stem cells because they come from a point of origin. But moving forward, when we can understand what makes a cell exhibit a certain phenotype, a very specific phenotype, once we understand that, and we can, let's say, reproduce the natural phenotype in a stem cell, then I think that is going to be a fabulous resource and is going to be probably the gold standard. But I'm not an expert in the area, but I suspect we're not there yet.
One question to ask Laura is actually whether what you did was affected by, you had a human tissue scandal, didn't you? I mean, I know it kind of came over here a bit because, was it not Alistair Cook, who was a very famous broadcaster over here, and his bones were part of that. How did that impact on the perception of tissue collection in the US?
I can say that I am aware of a few different scandals that have happened over the years, and I am here to represent Organs for Research, but having previously been in the OPO community, organ donation for transplantation, it was simply that the public had greater resistance to donation, and it seemed that with greater education, and education comes in all forms, as we all know. I mean, we see it now in television shows. It's written about in books. There are feel-good moments in opening up the paper in the morning when you hear about a transplant recipient meeting a donor family. Health fairs. Even our Department of Motor Vehicle is each year sending out a form asking people if they would like to donate organs and tissues for transplantation. And you may also know we have online organ donor registries that have gotten a great deal of press as well. So why do I answer the question saying all that? It's mainly because there has been so much public awareness surrounding the need for transplantation, the senseless death of people who are not looking for a cure for cancer. They only need a working liver, or they only need a working kidney. And on the flip side of that, I must also say the researcher out there looking to study cures for disease or develop new treatments and therapies needs that diseased kidney. They need that diabetic kidney, or that. So I think with public education and public awareness, my feeling is that any scandal can be overcome simply by the honest, the real dire need and the value of these tissues. So I think that comes across in the education.
One very quick question.
It's actually a question and a comment. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's fine.
I just want to take up your point, Vivian. I absolutely agree with you that education is not necessarily the answer. If you're looking at educating the public, the education ought to be to us. Because when you look at the attitudes of presumed consent across Europe, there are far more ingrained feelings that have nothing to do with education, nothing to do with scandals, but a lot to do with a moral and religious basis. I mean, the presumed consent in Europe is divided on Catholic Protestant grounds. And what we need to do is research more and find out what it is that really is underlying people's reluctance to consent and that sort of thing. The other thing I want to say is one of the major obstacles to getting all of this expedited is ethics, and I think two speakers alluded to that, because not only have we got this legislation that is over-interpreted locally, we have certain people who sit on ethics committees who I think have a hidden agenda. I sit on two, and I'm trained in science and in law, and I do believe there are people there who come on ethics committees particularly to stop this sort of research. And they will over-interpret legislation in their own way, and research is stopped, and people just give up, or they have to go through mountains, as you said, mountains of paperwork several times over, asked all sorts of odd questions, and then you think, well, is it really worth it? My life is too short. And I think we need to do something about that. We need to streamline the legislation and streamline the interpretation of it, and perhaps weed out the wrong people on ethics committees. Maybe that's a bit negative, but I have a lot of experience in this area.
Right, well, this is meant to be an open session at the moment, and anyone can follow up on any point of interest from the talk presented earlier. So, who would like to start? Right, that's excellent. Oh,
Why don't I? Bob, I'd like to make a point that picks up first of all from Vivian's hunch, I think you called it earlier in the day, and then I think was probably illustrated by the course of the various presentations as time went on. I think, Vivian, you described your hunch as being that whilst people say they're willing, when it gets to brass tacks, are they actually willing? And and I think that perhaps the source of your hunch being related to the transplant world is very different from some of our experience who work with patients. Because, Jane said that she was aghast that only 5% of patients in Greater Glasgow were given opportunity to consent, but I'm willing to bet that 99% of the 5% did give consent. And therefore, in the surgical donor domain, the challenge is to raise the number who are given the opportunity to consent.
I think it's very different. There are two quite distinct groups, aren't there? There's the post-mortem, but the fresh tissue is hugely important, I mean, as well as the surgical tissue. But I think both domains, it's clear that people are not being asked. I mean, certainly it's quite shocking when I've been round the various SHAs recently, and the number of people who are actually asked is extremely low. So, never mind not being recovered, it's just that they're not being asked. But there is then another problem about people saying that they'll do it, and then actually when it comes to it, and that's particularly the case for children, where there's a real need for children's tissues.
if I can actually follow on from that very, very briefly, the question about consent to donate by an individual, and that individual having the legal right to consent, but that being, let's say, objected to by next of kin subsequently. So if someone is killed in a road traffic accident, their organs, tissues, whatever, become available for transplant or research, and it was their intention that should happen, but still families, next of kin, do object, and although legally they don't have the right, I think in practice that is
going to cross that family.
No. But do you think that's a reflection of the point you made earlier about what's usual? I was struck by that, but somehow we've got to get across to people the importance of this, and simply to say, I don't think we ought to do it. For something that is so valuable, somehow we've got to get that across to people. And whether it is simply trying to make it usual.
I think making it usual is a huge part of it, but I also think it's the circumstances of death sometimes that are particularly difficult, because almost all of these deaths, brainstem deaths, are catastrophic events that have, these are not people who've been ill for a long time. No. This is just very sudden. So, the grief is all the greater. But I think also it makes the difference that they are not approached, because they can be seen in enormous distress, and actually doctors don't want to add to that. However, transplant coordinators are trained to deal with that and to ask in the best possible way.
Yes.
Can I just add a comment following that? So can we learn from what they're doing in the US in terms of the way they go about it? From what Dolores talked about, they seem to have a good system in place where they have got people in that will ask those difficult questions at really difficult times.
Well, one of the 14 recommendations of the Organ Donor Task Force was to set up a system of donor transplant coordinators who are funded and employed centrally. And I think that they're almost 3/4 of the way to recruiting. And probably somebody better than that will know better than me the figures, but they're nearly 3/4 of the way to recruiting. So I think that within 2 years you will see actually a step change in the number of people who are asked. And I think also that other thing that I keep banging on about is donor committees. I think it will have enormous effect to have lay people who are committed to organ donation and tissues for research within a hospital, challenging the chief executive and management as to why there haven't been donations in that particular hospital. I think that's a very powerful movement, and I think that if you want to use tissues for research, you should involve donor committees as soon as you possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, can I say I don't agree with, I couldn't agree with that more. We set up the Wales Cancer Bank and got the patients on board from the start. We don't have a problem with refusal for use in pharmaceutical industries. The patients get that. They really don't have an issue at all. There is no issue over Alder Hey. And so I think a lot of it is a difference between people who are being asked at near-death times and other people who are being asked when they're being treated. I work at Imperial as well, and we therefore have a consent form like Jane found doesn't really work because there's a tick box on the consent for surgery form. The issue there is actually not training the medical staff to make them realise this is an important function of their duty, is to get that consent. The patients to a man say, it's a research institute, I'm getting this treatment for free, why are you asking me? And it's costing us a lot to put in specialist nurses to get the consent, but we actually find we get far more out of them. The patients are consented at an awkward time. They have a chance to ask our nurses things. The nurses are embedded within the team. They take the preoperative bloods. Our tissues are good quality. Our serum and blood is good quality because it works with the system. And people who try to do things outside the system and not involve patients, I think, are missing a trick. I talk all over the world about tissue banking. I'm on my second or third tissue bank now. And, and when you get there with the patient's representatives and you sort of say to them, well, what do you think about this? They say, well, why aren't you using this? Is this criminal to throw it in the bin? Another interesting thing as well, in the experience in Australia, they have a BRCA mutation breast cancer bank set up in Melbourne. And there they actually have the patients pre-consented prior to death, and they ring up and say, I'm not very well, it may not be long, don't forget to take my bits. That's the sort of commitment you will get from patients if you ask them in the right way. We just don't phrase the questions well, and we're scared of patients.
It's about what I said about them, about having somewhere centrally in the hospital,
Yeah.
as you come in, that says it's normal for us to ask, and whether it's for donation of organs or whether it's donation for tissues for research, and it's there for everybody to see.
That's what our patient committee at Hammersmith has asked us to do, but the legal guys and the trust are scared stiff. And we are supposed to be the academic health research centre. But we're too scared to put that in place. It's stupid.
Why are they scared?
They're scared because they'll be sued.
Yes, but-
They're scared because it takes one patient.
Yes, but what's the basis of it? How many have been sued?
Well, I can tell you, in the Hammersmith Bank, they've been going for about 10 years. They've had 8 requests for withdrawal because that's ensconced now in law. Those withdrawals have not been from patients not wanting their material to be used for research. It's been from Muslim patients, female patients who've consented, gone home, told their husbands, and their husbands have said, oh, you can't do that, and gone up to the hospital and asked for it. So you do have to remember as well, you've got the racial and religious differences as well, particularly in the hospitals in London where it's much more prominent, and put things in place. If when you go around the world talking to people about this, you find that there's the most peculiar bars in some countries about what you can do. In China, they don't want the blood taken. Now, for us, we think blood sample easy, unless you're a bloke, because we do find a problem we have with the men don't want needles in their arms. But it seems to us that would be a logical thing to start with. But in some countries, that's taboo. So you have to have a great awareness of local things and talk to the locals. If you do that, it's easy.
Listen to the customer.
Absolutely, not the customer, the patient.
But
You've also got to listen to the customer because you've got to provide the customer what he wants.
He is the customer.
Yeah,
The
but you
patient
also,
is
yeah.
the customer.
But you also have to be aware of what the scientists want and actually tell them sometimes it's not possible because a lot of them don't understand.
Please, Barry.
Yes, I'm Barry Fuller. I work with one of the organ donor procurement services, a bit like an OPO, and I think our colleague from New York identified a very important point in your talk, that the resource allocation required to deliver organs for research, you have costed, and you have a system which will reimburse your health services to do that. Our health services are obviously stretched. We don't have people standing around waiting to do that. So there is a resource implication on taking your approach, and it needs to be costed and funded somehow, either by the end users or whoever.
Almost certainly the end user. Sorry.
And it might be helpful to know that not all of the organ charges are in fact necessarily reimbursed to the OPO. Most of them are, those that are being recovered for transplant. Kidney is always reimbursed, because certainly in the end, and then it does become a bit like a business model, if you will, it's just much more cost efficient to to transplant a patient with a kidney than it would be to maintain them on dialysis for 10, 20 years. So it's those types of things. And they're moving to the same types of models, I believe, for liver as well. And then there are what we call standard acquisition charges, which each OPO, well, then that gets a little complicated. But in effect, it is about a reimbursement scheme, yes. Yes. Well, we've got our own bullets to bite, but it might not be about transplantation and research. We just need a public health care system, that's all.
Can I? Oh, sorry, there's a question over here. That's fine. Carry on, and I'll follow on.
Actually, I just wanted to make a comment following the lady who was mentioning Australia. I too was living in Australia. I was involved in the eye bank there, and I do work in vision research, so I know exactly what you mean. People are very squeamish about eyes. I think perhaps Australia is a better model than America, with no disrespect, because it's a simpler country, and I think it's all about communication. Simpler,
Not simpler like dumb, right?
Fewer people, fewer states. And I think you'll agree, communication is much more straightforward there, whether it's written or, and I think that's what we get bogged down with, the communication, and lack of common sense and too much, trying to get around it and, please, instead of getting straight to the point and saying this is what we want. And I think Australia is a better model, perhaps, for our. Would you agree?
I agree with you. I think the funding structures are very similar to ours. I mean, I have NCI money, so I know all about the NCI system and the problem of ethics and everything in the States. So, but Australia, I think, should be the model. They have a lot of very successful biobanks. I don't know why we're still talking about this. We've done it in Wales. We've got 3,000 patients consented since 2005. We've embedded everything in the health service. We've put money into pathology. It works if you put the money where it's needed and you stop saying it's in the universities. It's not in the universities. It's in the healthcare system. And the NHS could actually be recovering a lot of this costs itself. But it doesn't seem to have the will to see that it could do that and still maintain the patient confidence.
Too many layers.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with your point about ethics as well. I have sat on boards in London as a researcher and had to tell them what the HTA regulations said because the chairman didn't know.
Can I just ask that a question that I've raised before, because I'd be really interested in people's views. This thing about commercial use and academic use, because you're not going to take away from the general public this view they have of the pharmaceutical industry as a beast with horns. It's very, very ingrained. And that was very clear from the deliberative events for the Organ Donor Task Force, that commercial benefit from their donations was regarded as a problem.
I think it'd be interesting to know the question you asked to get that response. Yeah. You just don't see it in other areas.
But maybe I think with one-to-one, and it's particularly if people coming in for surgical procedures, then they don't have a problem in some ways with the bit that they're getting shot of anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it might be that, but it's also we don't have a problem with academic versus industrial use. Somebody somewhere has to develop these drugs. It's not, I work in academia. I've worked in academia for years in some of the best universities in this country. I can tell you for free they haven't got a cat's chance in hell in bringing anything to market. It has to go through pharma if it's going to be a successful drug, particularly for cancer. Patients accept that. And maybe we actually need to educate the public a lot more and start talking about this. We hide these things because we don't like to upset people. But I think there is a time for us to have this discussion, and particularly now with us having to make decisions on who gets health care, because the drugs are going to become more and more expensive. They're going to be marker-driven therapies if we ever get around to getting the tissue to develop the markers, which is a serious problem. I've just come from a meeting in Brussels where there is no way we're going to get biomarkers out quickly because we don't have access to tissue that easily, right the way across Europe.
Yeah, sorry. Let's have Barry, then can we have Brian, and then Martin.
So can I just come back to you, because my experience isn't that anyone distinguishes biotech, pharma from academic. The Peterborough experience was that the whole hospital actually provided material. In Meiji went to a pharmaceutical company and everybody knew about it, right? And none of it, as far as I was aware, hardly at all went to an academic organisation. And the whole population going through Peterborough Hospital actually signed up to that and were very happy on a one-to-one basis. We haven't had any of our patients, actually. The information sheet says very clearly it can go to either or. My experience with patients, they just want it to go to the best use, and that's decided by the ethics committees. And it's the ethics committee that decides if it's a good use or a bad use and whether it's actually a biopharma or not. So I think there may be something different about transplantation, which is different to, as you say, somebody actually saying, well, I'm having a piece off, I've got an illness. I actually, you've got a person that's ill. I think that's the difference. You've got someone that's ill and actually therefore feels that they want to actually do something with this tissue that's taken out. So I think there's a real positive attitude there. I'd just like to raise, I've actually been in Glasgow now nearly 10 years, and I went there just after Alderhay, which is now about a decade. And I walked into Glasgow, and everyone said Glasgow was actually the Alderhay of Scotland because we had so enormous numbers of tissues. What my experience is that what we've done is we've only taken part of the problem and solved it. So we've produced an enormous amount of governance. So we've produced a lot of basic clinical governance, academic governance, research governance. We've produced lots of hoops that people have to go through. And that's impacted on a whole series of things. One thing we haven't said about is just general post-mortems. Last year in Glasgow, there were 5,500 people who died in hospital deaths. There were only 78 post-mortems, all right? We actually no longer teach medical students actually to understand disease because we've got nothing to demonstrate it. So they only see disease from the outside and what they see in books. So that's a major problem that's come out of the Alderhay situation. And the reason that we've also actually not got young doctors that have now got the experience and have actually got the wherewithal to actually approach patients, to actually ask for a post-mortem because it's actually quite an onerous procedure, so they don't actually go through it. The follow-on from that is that because you've only got 78 post-mortems, you've got a whole cohort of senior pathologists that are now becoming de-skilled. Therefore, they can't actually train the junior pathologists for tomorrow because you've only got 78. We have about 30 trainees in our cohort, and they have to do about 20 to 30 a year, and we've only got 78 a year between 30 of them. So you can see that we're having to reconsider our whole training program for pathologists. So if you start looking at the impact, it isn't just an impact on transplantation, it's a massive impact on everything that's happening in the training of doctors and medicine in general, and pathologists. So we've got a de-skilled population, so we're soon going to have people that can't do post-mortems at all.
Brian?
My point isn't substantially different from anyone who's gone before me. I think it might well definitely be a difference between the willingness and the understanding of patients versus the... I don't know whether your groups were the worried well, if I can call them that. Yeah.
I think there's a critical difference between if you've got something.
Absolutely.
And actually, a main motivation is I don't want anybody else to have this too. And, you're happy to sign away bits that anyway you'd be glad to get shot of.
Yeah. I mean, if I can illustrate it with an anecdote I like to use a lot. So about 5 years ago, I had a meeting with about 100 to 120 patients in a room, and I was basically trying to gauge their opinion on key things that would affect human research tissue biobanking. And inevitably, I asked the question, from a platform, how do you feel about a commercial organisation accessing tissues in a state-run, government-funded biobank for use in research? And I was a bit anxious about asking that question because I wasn't too sure, although I thought I knew what the answer would be, I really wasn't too sure what would come in the moment. And this chap, straight away, hand in the air, stood up, and then the theatre of the moment was even better because he'd had a laryngectomy, and I had to do that funny speaking through a little transducer thing, and croaked his answer to me. And so everyone was sort of waiting with bated breath for what he was about to say, and he said, "I would insist on it." And the minute he did that, the whole room burst into applause. And I was absolutely floored by that response because it was I was expecting support, but not that sort of support. And then he followed up by reaching into his pocket and he pulled out a sort of bubble pack of tablets. And he said, "When I take my medication every day, let me see, it says Merck Sharp and Dome. It doesn't say the University of Southampton. I know where my medicines come from and I want these people to help me." And that was his response. It was such a powerful moment that I like to tell the story because I think it does reinforce the reality of how patient groups feel about things.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, it's a very similar point, actually. We've never really seen patients say, yeah, we'll sign consent for research with academia, but not for big pharma, effectively. They just want the drugs to be put to good use, and most people realise that drugs are developed in a combination of academia and pharmaceutical companies. We're Astrand, and we work in this space, and we're a for-profit company, but in 14 years, it's only the last year, 1 year, we've actually made a profit anyway. So we're, strictly speaking, a non-profitable company.
We're trying for profit company.
In any case, it's a bit of a non-issue, I think. It's a bit of a sidebar issue. The key thing is, how do we develop new therapies for disease?
May I just ask what the difference was in setting up the Welsh Bank compared to other people who've tried to set up tissue initiatives, or who bit the bullet in providing the fund? Why is it different in your... What was the difference in your situation?
I don't think it actually was that difference. It's the fact that we just said, oh, bugger it, we're going to do it, pardon the French. But basically, I mean, we did it from the bottom up. I actually trained with an awful lot of the pathologists in Wales, and when I actually wasn't there at the beginning, I went back from Cambridge, and all of a sudden we're setting up a tissue bank. Jerry, you know about tissue banks, get on with it. And basically, we did it from the bottom up. So it's funded by the government, largely, but also funded by Cancer Research Wales, which is our own charity in Wales, not CRUK, not related to it in any way. And the WAG money provides the sort of bedrock. And it's top sliced off the Department of Health budget. So the money goes back into the health service. And we were adamant from the word go, the majority of the money was going to go back in. And it was going to go back into pathology, which is where the tissues are. They're not in surgery. The surgeon does their own normal operation. The tissue then goes to pathology. So the people doing the work are based in pathology, nowhere else. As soon as you do that and you put the money into pathology, the gates open. And in fact, the pathologists in Swansea, which is a very busy hospital, have worked it to their own advantage, have improved getting other pathologists in, have raised their own work standard level, have MSc projects for their BMSs, and they can really see the benefits. So, you know, it works, but you do it from the ground up. You do need IT, so you have to bite that bullet, and you have to have a good IT system, because the hospital IT systems won't work. But basically, we just said, we're not waiting any longer, we know how to do this, we're getting on with it. It's been very successful, it's been extremely well received by the patients. The other thing that we did do was we tried to get the trust to talk to us, and they all went, no. Well, yes, we'll have a meeting, and then they didn't turn up. So I got frustrated and said, right, we're going public. And we did, we went public. We got the media in, everything. And from then on, not a problem. And it really is patient power. If you get the patients behind you, everything becomes possible because they elect the politicians. That's how you do it.
Because Jane didn't mention that in Scotland what's happened is, similarly, the Chief Scientist Office, they realised there was money that was paid into the health service, which is actually called Support for Science, but it was all being used to actually fund patient care. Because there was never enough money for patient care. So the chief scientist actually decided that he wanted to claw all this money back. So he's clawed back many millions, and they've now actually put funding into the biorepositories in the four major centres. So Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh and Glasgow have all now actually got core funding, which would do a similar basis to actually what's been done in Wales. And I think you need to do that in England as well.
I think that's right. It clearly demonstrates that it's possible. I mean, it's possible in Scotland, it's possible in Wales. Why would it not be possible in England? Is there another point on this topic?
I think there are two things.
We'll just do that, because I want to move on to another.
Well, if you will, yeah. I mean, one is it's got to be bottom up, and the successful tissue banks are the ones where it comes from bottom up. And there's an incentive for all the participants to participate, that whether it's to proceed, for those where they want to get their own research, they will get consent, and it's never, ever a problem. The second thing is to have the trusts give more than just lip service, and that's what they do. Yes, research is very important, so is saving the poor in Africa. They don't put in the systems, they don't monitor it, they don't enforce it, and you need those two things. And it's no good, I think, having all the great and good from industry saying, why is it not happening? It's because they're not engaging with the people on the ground who will deliver for them and providing the incentive to make it worth their while.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think it's probably time to look at the other side of the equation, and rather than the supply, it's the use of the tissue. We do have a number of representatives from industry here, and the strong impression I've got, having been involved in acquiring human tissues and performing service work on human tissues is that the demand for it is within the industry is strictly limited. Now, I have a number of reasons for this, and one is perhaps inadequacy of supply. If you can't get the tissues, you can't rely on it with any frequency. Therefore, how can you base your experimental work upon it? So, well, let's just go back to the rat. And I'm sure that is an issue to a degree. But it's something we need to break out of, because the rat isn't going to give you the right answers. And I truly believe that human models will. And also, a strong interest of mine is in accessing tissues from organ donors, viable tissues for functional work. But the call for this within industry is very limited. And talking to Dolores a little while ago, her access to such tissues is absolutely brilliant. The calls from her customers for using it, and within Astrand, this is an experience, and previously in Pharmagene, the same thing. There is a lack of commitment to human tissue approaches within industry. I mean, is this true? What do the industrial guys think?
I think it's true to a degree. I think there's a perception it is difficult to get hold of, and because of that perception, people don't bother a lot of the time. And the bureaucracy of actually getting it, which is a big issue. But I think there is a perception it's quite hard to use. Obviously, it turns up at times that aren't always convenient, and people. So
It's got to be taken out at times when it's not convenient.
Absolutely, and it obviously transplant tissue is hit or miss. You get sometimes you can get 12 bits in a year, or you may get 2 bits. And with that sort of supply, people wonder sometimes if it's worthwhile. So if there was a lot more access, I think a lot more people would buy
I was talking to Jackie Trafford the other day, and she was saying access is not a problem. It's just purely demand.
I think 2 points. One point I made earlier, and I have to say I don't always agree with your position. Sometimes the rat is a good model.
Sorry.
And when it is a good model, it can be used.
No, I'm not denying that.
So I think from our perspective in industry, why would we use expensive animal models if we could use good human models? So if the models will work, the demand will be there, and I guarantee it, we will use those models because they're cheaper and faster.
Who's going to develop the models? Is that not up to you? Or isn't it? Maybe it isn't. Maybe
I think it's a collaboration. I don't think it's up to us to sort it out. I think it's a science community issue, and that's what should be done. And it shouldn't be just saying industry sort it out. It should be the whole community.
Yes. Yeah. Well.
So I'm from Pfizer, and I guess there's several points. The supply or the irregularity of supply makes it very difficult. When you're an industry, you're driven by timelines to deliver on things. So if you want to set up a screening cascade, you need to know that you can do a certain part of that, when you want to, not when the supply is there. So that can make us less willing to integrate human tissue into a cascade. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but what I'm saying is that is certainly a past reality.
Yes.
I think there is a growing realization, based on some of the points that were presented today, that we need to do more human work to get greater predictive validity. So industry is looking for the opportunity to do more work in human tissue. But that's got to be twofold. It's got to be healthy human tissue in some cases, but we need the diseased tissue. Because why do we do animal models? Because we want to create the disease, in inverted commas, in the animal. So if you can't get hold of diseased human tissue, it may not be appropriate to screen something in healthy human tissue. Inflammation is a great example. If there's no inflammation, it's quite difficult to see whether your compound will block inflammation. And then finally, I think there is a gap in the perception of it, we can't get hold of it, versus perhaps, what I've heard today is the supply is there. And then the biggest hurdle, which everyone's talked about, is there's that much damn paperwork to do, that can you be bothered? And it's a real shame that if bureaucracy is our biggest issue that stops us being able to do this.
One quick point about the demand thing, which I think is quite interesting. Where we're not under time pressure for regular routine supplies, such as in problem solving around adverse drug reactions, for example, we do often use frequently when we can get at human tissue, because we can work with the infrequency of supply.
If the supply was resolved, the frequency and the quality of supply was resolved, what impact would that have on your enthusiasm to develop the methodologies, at least so you're in a position to compare?
I think the enthusiasm's already there. It's not a lack of enthusiasm, it's pragmatism, I don't know. I mean, this is why I'm interested in the stem cell of the future, because that will resolve at least that problem.
Yes.
And a lot of pharma, if you watch the media, are heavily investing in stem cell technology for those reasons. So it's not lack of enthusiasm.
Gotcha.
Well, I think part of it also is that the driving force, as you mentioned, is the lack of regulatory requirement. Because I'm with a CRO called Apredica in Boston, and we work with mostly human hepatocytes for human tissues. But it's really, really difficult to sell services to industry with this sort of attitude, because it's not quote-unquote validated and it's not required, right? So it has to come, part of it has to come from regulatory.
Which, of course, is the initiative of Safer Medicines Trust.
Well, I think that's exactly where this bill comes in, isn't it? You know, that until we have a review of the marketed products and we can predict, I think the efficacy side is going to be much more difficult, but safety, it might be easier to make some grounds and certain safety models. But I think, you know, the essence is actually captured in the bill, which is the reason we're here today, I suppose. I'd quite like to, and I know there's a couple of, I hate to put people on the spot, but we've got a couple of regulators here who, if they can tell us of anything that's going on, perhaps in the European arena.
I think as a regulator, if I actually went to the pharmaceutical industry and said, right, from next week, everything in human tissues, I would be lynched, because it's not there. So it's not up to the regulators to say, you must do this. As a regulator, I frequently say, you do that, I will accept it. That's not a problem. I represent the EU on ICH, and we spoke to the ECVAMs, and told them, you develop these assays, we will accept these assays. If you do not develop these assays, we will not tell you to develop them.
Well, I think that's nicely placed back in the pharmaceutical industry.
Can I just raise one point? I'm always having to deal with this issue of regarding animal research, and it's the fault of animal research. The animal hasn't demonstrated this product to be safe, and therefore, testing these products in animals is totally meaningless, and we must move to human tissues because that's the only alternative. That is just not common sense, and it's not good science, that sort of argument. I'm tired of hearing it. Animals have done a tremendous amount to further medicine research. And not only that, how can you blame the animals for not demonstrating Vioxx is safe when it was tested in God knows how many clinical trials? So the human being himself wasn't a good model for the human being. So you cannot keep blaming animal tests for providing rubbish data. And I'm sick of hearing it. But I do agree the way to go is sort of a, human tissue. I mean, it's got tremendous potential to further science, even more than animals.
It just seems there's a lot of inertia in the system, and to get the ball rolling, you have to make a strong point. And I have been accused of being sort of anti-animal experimentation, but I'm not. I did 30 years of it, and I've used it very successfully and unsuccessfully. So I know its strengths, I know its weaknesses, and I do know that if you try hard enough, you can get anything you want. So you've got to be very careful about what you do. And it does have value, but it doesn't do everything. And we now are in a position with the industry, we are in a position where the drugs are just not appearing. And it does seem to me to be a logical process to move more towards human biology in evaluating these compounds. It's not going to answer all the questions, absolutely, but it's going to, hopefully, address those questions in a more relevant fashion, and it's going to be right more often, I hope.
I think there are other reasons why drugs are not predictive, and it's not that the animals aren't predictive, it's because from the pharmaceutical industry to have the third drug in a class is just no point, because NICE will say no and no one will prescribe it. So the pharmaceutical industry will only develop it almost in isolation of each other. So clearly the research is far more focused within each industry. So you will never see Glaxo doing every different drug because it's not in there. They couldn't possibly do it. They would never get their drugs on the market. So it is not just the fact that the tests we have are killing all the drugs before they get to the market. It's the fact that financially there is no point in getting a lot of drugs to the market because they will never be accepted.
Just a very quick comment, just to rebound on what you just said. I'm Delphine Beroussel from France. Belvifarm, it's a CRO, preclinical CRO company. We actually provide the pharmaceutical industry with both studies using animals and using human tissues, and I absolutely agree with you that they're actually quite complementary to each other, depending on what you're looking for and what you're trying to achieve for a test. Anyway, one of our feeling in terms of barriers to human tissue work from the pharmaceutical industry is sometimes that the variability that is absolutely linked to the obtention of those samples, human samples, and linked to the fact that there is a huge variability within the human population, and that variability is not present or mostly better standardized, let's say, in the animal population, whatever the disease is. That is maybe one of the hurdles that the pharmaceutical industry, and one of the reasons why they are quite hesitant in using this type of assays.
I think that's why we need the kind of study that's proposed in this bill. But what I think would be good is if it was done in a European, or even better, between the States and Europe, as opposed to just in the UK. It would be great for the UK to take the initiative on it, but I think it could be done much more comprehensively and quicker, probably, if it could be done across Europe.
If I can comment on this, because it's really, in our experience, it's primarily AstraZeneca and GSK in the UK that complain about the amount of internal bureaucracy. And obviously we work with global pharma throughout the world. As a top 30 pharma, we work with 29 of them. So I think a lot of it is to do with internal issues within those two companies, and that should be eminently sought outable within those companies. I mean, if David and I can go in there and help you and say, look, these are assured, these are quality guaranteed or assured, please tell us what you need and we will assure that and keep it very simple. We are only too happy to work within that. It makes it very simple. Human tissue authority on this, actually. I think it's more about issues about, we had talked about post-mortem network in the US. That is a great network we work with, but we still have issues with that to do with AZ and GSK in the UK because of specific requirements they have.
Can I come back to that?
Sure.
Maybe explain why you may see some of that, and it relates to the comment before that the public always sees us as a beast with horns, which I think you said. We are actually more stringent with our own governance than is required by the HTA. And one of the reasons for that is because we are constantly concerned of the public image of the pharmaceutical industry, who seem to think we only make profits and always seem to forget we make medicines. So we are probably a bit more strict with ourselves, but that doesn't mean we don't use human tissue. We use it all the time.
Yeah, can I just expand on what David said? I think one reason why we aren't getting new products on the market is because, to a large extent, an awful lot of the major disease states have already been covered by medicines. And so what Big Pharma is having to do is having to find new mechanisms to treat diseases and not making me-toos, as David already alluded to. There are plenty of generic companies who will do that after 10 years. So the thing is, really, and I think as we move forward, we are going down the sort of biotech route, and in order to do that, I think companies are having to look at human tissues far more and actually do all this phenotyping and genomics and all that sort of thing. So I think we are already going down the use of human tissues, and so it will come, but it's not going to come overnight.
I regularly act to advise people who are setting up studies in relation to the use of human tissue, and I'm frequently hearing about this regulatory burden. And I must say, as someone who works full-time in the field, I just don't buy it at all, unfortunately, and I think it must be self-generated. And it often is self-generated, because when I tell people that actually, no, that's not true, that's not the law, let me show you the Act, it doesn't say that anywhere in there, they are often quite taken aback by that. And I think that there is definitely, and actually this is true of academic researchers and industry researchers, it's not unique to industry at all. And so I think there is definitely a sense of researchers have got the wrong end of the stick in relation to the regulation, and they are willing to shackle themselves and not run with this in a way that I really can't fathom out why it is. But if I turn it back to the supply side, all all the regulatory and ethical issues are really at the supply end of the supply chain, and therefore it's down to the biobanks, the tissue supply companies in this country to deal with the ethical issues, to deal with the licences, to deal with the storage in a licensed environment. And therefore, for the end user, it should be easy. It should be easy that if you've got a good project that grants you access to those samples, the regulatory issues are no more than the usual health and safety in your laboratory, effectively. And so please, readjust your thermostats with regard to the regulatory side of things. I notice there's no one from the Human Tissue Authority or NRES here today, but I'm sure that... But they're supposed to be, yeah. Oh, there is there? Oh, hi.
I've just been keeping very quiet.
Yeah.
And your warm recommendations to the way that we've approached regulations. So
Oh, I was just going to say that you would be aghast to hear that you were putting up so many barriers, I would suggest.
Well, it's always good to sort of hear what people have to say, outside of inspections. But our recent research evaluation project of stakeholders' perceptions of regulation would confirm that view, that people find it hard to distinguish our remit from regulation in its broadest terms, and it's important to remember that it is only part of a much broader regulatory framework. So thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Especially incognito.
Absolutely.
Say something about, again, there's a lot of talk about the replacement of the human tissues replacing animals. And again, I think, the words itself, human tissue, tells you the limitations of it. It is a tissue. And what we need to do is actually what happens in a whole being. And I think that's one reason why, whether you use human tissues or animal tissues in vitro, and I think both are used, people use computer simulations now, and that's becoming better. But at the end of the day, people put it in a whole animal just to see what happens. If you want to see if something's antihypertensive, a slice of liver is not going to, whether it's human or animal, isn't going to tell you that. All you can do is to try to see if it actually happens in an animal, and to see if something really dramatically horrible doesn't happen in a mammal, and you can sort of say, well, the risk-benefit is actually going into a clinical trial. And I mean, that's the way it works. I mean, human tissues are not going to replace a whole animal, I don't think, for quite a while. So,
No.
that's the inherent limitation.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that, but it's not necessarily quite as simple as that, in that you can make quite complex, and it will be increasingly possible to make complex interactions of different tissue types on chips, and look at how a more integrated system will respond to a drug. That's one point. The other thing, of course, is you're absolutely right. The whole integrated organism is far more than the sum of its parts, and you really, it's almost impossible to know what's going to happen in the whole human being, and therefore it's very tempting to put it in a whole animal. But of course, then it's a choice of animal, isn't it? And I think that a lot needs to go into identifying the most relevant animal, and I am absolutely horrified by what I see many years after I've stopped working in asthma. People are still using mice and sheep to test their anti-asthma drugs. What the hell are they doing that for? Sheep, everything's positive in the bloody sheep. I mean, it's great if you want to further your project, but it's useless as far as identifying the potential of your drug as an anti-asthmatic. And mouse is no better. But of course, they're the ones that are used. There's so much background with them, although most of it's negative, but nevertheless, there's so much background in them that people continue to use them. And that's not intelligent. I don't think it's intelligent use of animals. But I do support the intelligent use of animals, but it's got to be intelligent.
Just to follow on from that, I think the first area is probably reduction rather than replacement. And I think, coming back to the comment from my colleague at Pfizer about predictive validity, and that's really the key thing that's, for me, is missing. Speaking as someone that is offering these tests and finding that on a project-by-project basis, they are sorting out good drugs from bad drugs. But there isn't a wider review of that evidence the way that there is for cell-based tests or certain animal-based tests, where people have actually looked all the way from an endpoint in a cell-based test to a clinical endpoint and said, okay, what is the correlation between these two markers? That is missing for human-based tests, and I think that's evidence that everyone, again, needs to try and build up. And then once that evidence is in place, I think there's a greater commercial reason for the pharmaceutical industry to use the human tissues regularly, and a greater amount of evidence for the regulators to put them in the regulations.
They have to be available.
I'm afraid we're now going to have to draw this to a close. I think it's just sort of warming up, but we've run out of time, and we're now going to be joined by Lord McColl, who is going to wind up proceedings. But I'd like to say, thank you very much for taking part in this, and I hope that everyone has enjoyed it, and I hope that everyone's got something out of it. I'm not quite sure that we've resolved too many questions, but we've certainly aired a few. So,
are there any kind of next steps?
we're coming to Cathy will deal with next steps. Lord McColl.
Thank you. Well, I've enjoyed this meeting very much indeed. I was a bit worried that the discussion might not be so good in this particular room, but actually it's the best we've ever had. And so probably we ought to take all the seats out permanently. It's interesting hearing the whole problem about overcoming bureaucracy. A young lady of 100 came to consult me with a cancer here that needed to be removed under local. And she started off the consultation saying, "I'm not spending the night in your hospital, dangerous places." So I said, the customer is always right. I go to the day case surgical unit. They refuse to have her because she's 30 years over the age limit. So the game is, how do you overcome bureaucracy? And that's what I've always enjoyed doing. So we got her young son-in-law, he's 84, to bring her up, drive her up to the hospital. And arm in arm, we walked down into the operating theatre and got onto the table and started operating, thereby bypassing 4 lots of bureaucrats. Oh, it was joy. And did the operation. We always have music playing. And because one day a guy came into the theatre, sat up in the trolley and said, "I object to this music." So I said, "Well, I'm very sorry. What's wrong with it?" He said, "What's wrong with it? You're about to operate on me and you're playing Fauré's Requiem." So we were. So now we ask them what music they want, although we discourage numbers like "The Day My Heart Stopped Still" and things like that. Anyway, the operation was fine, and I said to her, "Okay, Mrs. Spears, it's over. Last stitch is in." "Good," she said. She sits up, swings her leg off the table, and then the bureaucrats arrived. And the first thing they said was, "Lie still, Mrs. Spears. We're taking you to recovery for a few hours." And she said, "Recovery from what? I walked in here and I'm certainly walking out again." See, this is patient power, and this overcomes. I was very impressed with the idea that you change things bottom up. And the idea of patient power, too, is so important. And wasn't it great to hear about Wales and Scotland? What did they do? They just got on and they did it. It's like that advertisement for Nike sports clothes. Just do it. And I think that's the answer today. Thank you all for coming. And I'd like just to introduce Cathy Archibald, who's the director of Safer Medicines Trust, to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lord McColl, for hosting the whole afternoon for us. It's been absolutely tremendous, and we really, really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. I know some of you have come an awful long way, and it's been a fantastic gathering, and an awful lot has come out of this, and I think there's an awful lot more still to come. It's very clear that human tissue is a precious and valuable and tremendously important resource, and that more use needs to be made of it. And I hope that this meeting will create an impetus and, crucially, a working party to take steps to remove some of the obstacles that are still getting in the way in some places, although not Wales. But so our email addresses are margaret@safermedicines.org and Cathy, with a K, @safermedicines.org. And not to say that we want to take it over or anything, but we're a central point. Margaret emailed to everybody or wrote to everybody with the working party document before today. So please contact us if you have anything further to say or to add, or would like to be on any working party that gets going, because we'd really like to see something becoming of this. And we were particularly delighted to have people from the MHRA here, because we really do see them as holding the master key. And I did hear what you say, but I still believe that if it was a regulatory requirement to have more extensive tests in human tissue than are currently required, then I think many of the obstacles would very quickly melt away. And I think that's something that we hope may happen, that pharmaceutical companies will submit more tests and that the MHRA will accept more. But I hope that you may have a role also for requiring more.